Choosing a good reference photo can make such a difference to your drawings and paintings. But what exactly is a good reference photo? I'll show you some examples of the things that I look for in my reference photos and explain what doesn't make a good reference photo to create artwork from. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I create drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow so that you can create realistic and professional artwork even if you're just starting out. Firstly, there are going to be exceptions for all of the points that I'm going to talk about, but in general, if you follow these guidelines, it will help you choose a good reference photo to use. The first thing that you need to make sure is that you have a clear photo. So choose one where the subject is not too far away. Make sure you choose a photo where your subject is close to the camera. If the subject is across the other side of the room, you're not going to be able to see any of those details. And even if you take a photo that is close up, sometimes the quality of the photo is still not fantastic. In the example on the right, the details in the dog's fur are barely visible at all, to the point where you can't really tell what direction the fur is actually going in. A good test to see if your photo does have enough detail is to zoom in. If you can see the individual hairs, then that's perfect. If you are a more experienced artist, you can get away with using photos that are not ideal, but like I said, there are going to be exceptions to all of these tips. Another thing that I like to look for, especially in pet portraits, is to make sure that the eyes are clearly visible. If you're drawing a human or an animal, generally there will be a lot of focus on the eye area because you can see quite a lot of the personality and emotion in the eyes. So make sure that you can see the colors, the shadows, and the highlights clearly in your reference photo. The next thing is the lighting. If you're working on a black subject or something that has really dark fur or hair, make sure that you can actually see a difference between the highlights and the shadows. The cat on the right is pretty much going to look like a black blob with eyes if you draw that, whereas the dog on the left clearly has definition of the fur growth because the highlights and shadows are really obvious, so that's going to make a much more interesting piece of artwork. Similar to the previous tip, if you're drawing a white subject, make sure that the photo is not overexposed, where you can't see any of the detail in the white areas. There is pretty much no detail in the white areas of the dog on the right, but the one on the left has really clear shadows, midtones, and highlights. You can also see the direction and the length of the fur growth, as well as multiple different colors throughout the white fur. Another thing to look for is good contrast. And this tip is not essential, but I find photos that have prominent shadows and highlights make really great artwork. It helps to create a more realistic 3D and generally more interesting piece of artwork. You can see the example on the right, there's not a lot of difference between the highlights, midtones, and shadows, so it just looks a little bit flat in comparison to the one on the left. In this example on the right, the photo was taken inside in unnatural lighting, so there's a lot of yellow, pink, and green in the white areas of the fur. It's quite obvious on white fur, but unnatural lighting like this can make other colors look quite different to the actual color of the dog as well. So try to get a photo that was taken in natural lighting. I find that the best photos are taken outside in the shade, and that way there's no direct sunlight on the subject, but it's still lit from the natural light of the sun. Although you can edit photos to help with this problem, it's still worth adding this tip, especially if you're doing pet portraits where the fur really needs to be the right color to match a specific dog. The next tip is making sure that your subject has a good pose. Sometimes a weird position can make an interesting piece of artwork, but in a lot of cases, it can just look awkward. When you look at the photo of the cat, it looks normal to us because it's a photo and we accept that as true. But the way that the paws are sort of curled under may look a little bit odd if you actually drew that. It could possibly look like you've made a mistake with your proportions because one leg looks a little bit short and the other is on a weird angle and you can't see the paw. So just keep in mind that just because it's a good looking photo doesn't mean that it will always translate well to artwork. And just like the last tip, sometimes a strange angle can also look unnatural in artwork. A good rule of thumb is to choose a photo that has been taken at eye level to the subject. That way it's less likely to have skewed proportions or angles that can translate weirdly into your artwork. And again, if you look at the photo on the right, it looks normal, but sometimes creating artwork from a photo like this may look a little odd. I have actually created a few drawings on weird angles, so it can definitely be done, but it's something to keep in mind, especially if you're a beginner. And the next thing is interest. So something that I always look for in my reference photos is something that makes it interesting or unique. This otter, for example, has an interesting pose. He's slightly out of the water, laying on his back, and I like this photo of the koala because of the positioning of his arms and legs. So instead of a portrait-style headshot of the animal, sometimes having an interesting pose can make your artwork look more interesting. The composition or emotion of the reference photo can also make it look more interesting. For example, the way this flamingo is cropped and the general composition looks pleasing to the eye and also shows that he's preening himself because the beak is behind the fluffed up feathers. So instead of drawing a portrait shot, you can choose photos like this where the subject is in action or doing something rather than just standing there. In this photo with the horse and the young girl, you can clearly see the emotion behind the relationship of these two, and that itself can make an interesting piece of artwork. I also love choosing unique subjects. For example, this hornbill is quite a striking subject. He's a little on the ugly side and wouldn't be the typical choice for a lot of people, but I love the colours and the emotion in the face, and I think it would make a really beautiful piece of artwork. This buffalo has drool coming from his mouth as well as a small bird on his head. He's also staring straight into the camera. To me, I think this piece looks very raw and natural, and it's just an interesting choice of subject. Another thing that I look out for when choosing a reference photo is strong lighting. I love photos that have a really obvious difference between the lights and the shadows. This lion has some really warm highlights on one side, but also a lot of cool shadows on the other side. And I like the unique lighting of this portrait with the contrast of the orange and blue lights. And the patches of light coming through the darkness on this tiger make the scene look much more interesting. Choosing the perfect reference photo is only part of the process to creating realistic looking drawings. In this tutorial on the top left of the screen, I'll explain how you can make your drawings look more realistic with this simple technique. So click on that and I'll see you over there.